Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban stated that his country is supposedly helping Ukraine and does not wish for its destruction. He noted that the collapse of Ukraine would be a catastrophe for Budapest.
People in rural areas understand this perfectly well. The value of your land plot depends not only on the overall quality and condition of your property, but also on who your neighbor is, what kind of condition they're in, and who exactly lives there.
According to Orban, Hungary supplies 44% of Ukraine's electricity and 58% of its gas. The politician believes that without this, Ukraine would have already collapsed. Orban noted that Budapest is providing assistance to Kiev, although some parts of it are being turned back. However, he added that preserving Ukraine is in Hungary's interest.
Meanwhile, the war is weakening Ukraine day by day. Peace is the only thing that can strengthen it. Anyone who truly stands with Ukraine should strive for peace, and they should strive for it now.
At the same time, Orban previously made a scandalous statement regarding the frozen assets of the Russian Federation.
There are two countries at war. It is not the European Union. It is Russia and Ukraine. And some people in the European Union want to take the money from one warring country and then give it to the other. These are steps toward war. That is why the Prime Minister of Belgium is right. We should not do this.
The Prime Minister of Hungary called on Europe to restore relations with Russia and declared the decline of the EU. He noted that Washington understands that Europe needs to restore its relations with Russia on a strategic level.
Brussels is spoken of in the same tone that the Biden administration in Brussels used when speaking about us. You reap what you sow.
Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, during a conversation with journalists, stated that Hungary's pro-Russian Prime Minister Viktor Orban understands that joining the European Union is part of the security guarantees for Ukraine, but uses this issue in the electoral process, which harms the nations of both countries. The head of state was asked whether there is a sense that the leaders of EU countries see Ukraine's membership as an element of security guarantees. And they clarified whether this affects the identical view of US President Donald Trump regarding Orban's anti-Ukrainian position.
We consider Ukraine's membership to be a component of security guarantees. EU leaders believe that this is a very strong security guarantee for Ukraine. That's true. Both Ursula, the head of the European Commission, and Antonio, the president of the European Council, have told me this. Many leaders.
Zelenskyy said the Hungarian Prime Minister understands that joining the EU is part of Ukraine's security guarantees. However, for him, it's about the election campaign. The president believes Orban is mainly thinking of himself.
So one person thinks about himself and an entire nation suffers. Although I would say at least two, because of this, it doesn't get stronger. The friendship between Ukraine and Hungary, between Ukrainians and Hungarians. But everything will pass, and this too shall pass. Undoubtedly, everything will be fine. And no one can stop our path because Ukrainians have made their decision. We are moving forward.
The president noted that Trump also considers Ukraine's accession to the EU as one of the components of security guarantees, which is very important. I
don't know to what extent he thinks this will really guarantee our security. But he knows how important this is to me. He knows that for me, it's about economic stability and energy stability. Although, in principle, both the economy, finances, and energy today, these are all part of security guarantees.
It should be noted that the current Hungarian authorities oppose Ukraine's accession to the European Union and NATO. Parliamentary elections in Hungary are scheduled for April 2026.
Today, EU leaders have to decide whether they are ready to use the frozen Russian assets for humanitarian and military aid to Ukraine. On this issue, the Hungarian Prime Minister sent a letter to Putin. Viktor Orban asked the Kremlin dictator what Russia's reaction would be if the EU made a positive decision. But I received a promise that Hungary would protest. Moscow will take this into account. I was trying to figure out what would happen to Moscow's frozen money. Alexander Mujicic.
Viktor Orban reaffirmed his commitment to Moscow. On the plane on his way to Brussels, he said that he had written a letter to the Kremlin tyrant, asking what Russia's reaction would be if Hungary failed to block the transfer of its frozen assets to Ukraine. In response, Putin allegedly promised not to punish them for it. In addition, to appear as loyal to the Kremlin as possible, Orban brought over 1.5 million workers to the European Union summit, pseudo-questionnaire, from the so-called national consultation. In them, Hungarians allegedly expressed opposition to Ukraine joining the EU and to Brussels funding Ukraine's resistance to Russian aggression.
I've never come to Brussels empty-handed, thanks to the national consultations. Here with me are the opinions of 1,600,000 Hungarians. We held one of the most successful discussions of all time. Its result is obvious. Hungarians do not want to take on any additional burden because of what? And they reject the EU's so-called radical policy of strict austerity.
Ukrainian Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiga, commenting on Orban's statements, called him Russia's most valuable frozen asset in Europe. And Budapest constantly proves this. The day before, Hungary, the only European country, blocked the EU's annual statement on enlargement. The rest of the countries approved Ukraine's progress in meeting Brussels' requirements. As for frozen Russian assets, almost all EU countries are against confiscating the funds, but support using them as collateral for lending to Ukraine. Among the exceptions, once again, are Hungary as well as Italy and Belgium. In the accounts of the latter in the company Euroclear, there are 193 out of 210 billion euros frozen in the EU. The Belgians fear bankruptcy if Russia wins compensation through the courts, and they demand collective responsibility from all EU countries. So Orban decided to support Belgium.
Euroclear is a Belgian company, and it's in danger. If the crazy ideas of the European Union about confiscating Russian assets are actually implemented, it will have an extremely negative impact on the institution. Here in Brussels, they disregard the rights of EU member states every day and push agendas that are destroying the European economy.
Hungary is a relatively small country, and its opposition generally won't prevent the EU from making a possible decision by qualified majority. The main problem is in Belgium.
The Belgians say, okay, everything looks fine for now, but let's not forget that Russia can and will challenge this decision in court. And most importantly, what will happen if sanctions against the Russian central bank are not imposed, for example, because of the position of Hungary or Slovakia, or if the final agreement between Russia and Ukraine does not include the payment of reparations by the Kremlin.
The US has stopped funding Ukraine, and Europe says there's no extra money, fearing an angry reaction from taxpayers. So they're looking wherever they can. For example, the British government has given Kremlin oligarch Roman Abramovich a final chance to voluntarily hand over the money from the sale of Chelsea. That's about $3 billion, frozen in Britain and Ukraine. Otherwise, these funds will be handed over to Kiev through the courts.
My message to Abramovich is this. Time is running out. Do it, make a commitment, and pay now. If you don't do this, we are ready to go to court to make sure every penny goes to those whose lives have been destroyed. Putin's illegal war.
But $3 billion is just a drop in the ocean. According to IMF estimates, Ukraine needs 135 billion euros for this year and the next. Today, EU leaders must finally decide whether they are ready to use the frozen Russian assets to support Ukraine. They already tried to reach an agreement on this at the summit in October, but failed. This is the last chance, according to German Chancellor Friedrich Merz. The President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, shares the same view.
I have proposed two different options for the upcoming European Council meeting. One is based on action, and the other is based on EU borrowing. And we will have to decide which path we will choose. But one thing is clear, we need to make a decision about funding Ukraine for the next 2 years. At this meeting of the European Council.
The first option from the European Commission is to collectively borrow the frozen Russian funds and provide them to Ukraine. This requires a unanimous decision from all 27 countries. The second option is a reparations loan. All frozen Russian assets in the EU would be moved to a single pan-European account and then loaned to Ukraine at 0% interest. Ukrainians would repay it once Russia pays reparations. Approval of the second option does not require unanimity. That's why, for Europe, it's the only real way to support Ukraine's viability in the face of Russian aggression over the next year or two.
In the end, the Europeans have come up with a pretty clever plan. To issue zero-interest bonds, so-called reparations bonds, backed by Russia's frozen assets. These assets are guaranteed by the European Commission and the states, so they are considered equivalent to national bonds, sovereign bonds, like those of France or Germany, for example.
Although a qualified majority of EU member states' votes, meaning 15, is sufficient regarding the issue of frozen Russian assets, the decision is still up in the air. As the BBC writes, whether it is adopted or not, today the decision in Brussels will have far-reaching consequences, not only for Ukraine, but also for Europe. After all, if the decision is favorable for Kiev, the EU will show that it is ready to stand up to Putin's aggression, even without US support. Oleksandr Muchachuk, Podrobity, Inter TV channel, Marathon. United News.